Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of UX Spotlight, where we're focusing on interfaces, usability, and interactions of movies, series, and everyday items and events. I am Dimitris Kontaris, user experience professional. SpaceX recently sent astronauts to the ISS, which is an amazing achievement for a private company and opens the doors to affordable space tourism and excursions. One thing that stood out to me though was this screenshot of the interface inside the capsule. All buttons are digital. And then I saw this image from tweets comparing the interfaces from the first mission to today's mission. As a result, in this episode of UX Spotlight, we will talk about one of the most important elements of a digital and physical interface, the button. In the physical world, the button is the perfect element. Let me give you an example. Look at this coffee machine. That's a product I use more times than I care to admit during the day. Without implying it's perfect from a usability and ergonomic standpoint, I just want to draw attention to the buttons here. You can clearly see which ones are the buttons. Their placement draws attention, and their shape indicates they can be pressed. On top of the buttons is an icon indicating the type of coffee you want to make, short for espresso and long for lungo. You can argue this isn't immediately apparent, but it seems the convention here is that coffee drinkers are aware of the difference. So, what's making this button a button? The fact that by looking at it, you immediately know what you need to do. The shape, it's roughly the size of a finger, so it will just need one finger to press it. It is separated from the rest of the elements, so your attention focuses on it and it has a very distinctive look. So, what makes a button well designed for the digital world? What I mentioned before are ways we are expecting the buttons to behave. We have created this mental model in our mind. Mental model is our perception about how a system works based on our experience with similar systems. If it works in a way we expect, that's good. If not, we have a problem, as we need to learn something new, and in psychology, this is called mental model discordance. This is the reason why every time Facebook changes its design drastically in the past, hundreds of groups are created with the sole purpose of complaining about this design and threatening that they're going to quit the platform, only to get used to it a few weeks later. The opposite example is Google. Google, on the other side, if you look at their main page, it has remained practically unchanged over the years. They even kept the I'm feeling lucky button, even though practically nobody is using it. But they did this to not disturb the structure of the page. To transition to the digital world, we need to transfer the mental model of the physical interactions to digital. Today we'll focus on the button itself. First, let's start with the size. One thing to keep in mind is the distance to the target being the button. That's where Fitts' law comes to play. The psychologist Paul Fitts predicted in 1954 that the time to hit a target is a function of the ratio from the point of origin to the target and the width of the target. It is essentially saying that the smaller the target and the longer the distance, the longer it will take to hit it. In addition to that, he expanded the algorithm to propose a difficulty index, so to measure how difficult the task to hit an area is, providing us with a way to measure difficulty using science. Index of difficulty of a selection task function is shown here, where D is the distance to the center of the target and W is the width of the target. So all that is good, but what is a good size for a button? Well, according to this paper, based on their findings, they recommend that target sizes should be at least 9.2 millimeters for single target tasks and 9.6 millimeters for multi-target tasks in order to keep the dimensions of the targets as small as possible without decreasing performance and user preference. And another paper from 2007 is basically revealing similar findings, like when the button icon was equal to or bigger than 40 by 40 pixels, according to their results, the reaction time was the fastest and the percentage of correct responses was the highest, around 98%. Apple's Human Interface Guidelines recommend a target of 44 by 44 pixels. Google's Material Design Guidelines recommend 48 by 48, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 44 by 44 CSS pixels. If you want to dig deeper into this, I'm linking the article in the comments that will satisfy the curious among us. Now that it's scientifically proven that size matters for buttons, let's move on to the next element that makes a button well designed, and that is affordance. How do we know a button is a button? In the not so distant past, digital buttons were designed to look exactly like physical buttons. They were mirroring the design of a physical button down to the shadows, textures, and everything. But that's what we call skeuomorphism. Skeuomorphism used to be a trendy word a few years ago, thanks to Apple, and it's coming from the Greek word skevos, which is pan or utensil, and morphe, which is a shape or appearance, so the appearance of a utensil. Skeuomorphism is when digital design of a physical object is directly mimicking its look and feel of the physical counterpart down to the texture details, and often unnecessarily or not contributing to the overall experience. This is, generally speaking, a good way to introduce a new concept to the digital world, as we saw in the past with graphic user interface from Xerox and later on with the iPhone. It generally helps people to get accustomed to an otherwise unfamiliar interface. At some point, though, things got out of hand, and everything was heavy on the fake texture side of things, often sacrificing usability for realism. People seem to draw the line when the version of macOS introduced leather binding on the calendar app, apparently based on Steve Jobs' leather seats on his private jet, which didn't add anything to the experience. When Apple changed course with iOS 7 and subsequent macOS versions, everything went completely to the other side of the spectrum. Textures, shadows, and almost everything resembling the real world was removed, and it went flat. This, however, had a negative impact on the buttons. With no shadows or any other affordances, users had to guess what is a button and what isn't, on an interface where everything looked more or less the same. Thankfully, this started to change again, and even though it's not perfect, you can argue that a balance has been found. But let's look at some types of affordances. One would be color or gradient. The other one would be shadows, thick outlines, an underline, or animating states and directing the user's attentions. These are just examples of affordances that can be used where appropriate, given the context and overall information architecture of the screen. Next up, audio. In the physical world, when you press a button, you often have some audio feedback, like a click-cling or a ching something. It is often good practice to add some feedback to the press of the button in an audio format. Games do this all the time. How satisfying is that? There are examples of audio use in buttons, like the ones we saw on Facebook Messenger, and the click that you usually hear, and they're very useful to communicate that the button has been pressed. So, what happens if you have more than one button? Which one is the most important one? How do we know which type of button we need on our interface? If you are or have been spending time with a UX designer, and if not, you should, I hear they're great guys and girls, you must have heard at least once them mentioning the term CTA. CTA stands for Call to Action and is essentially another name for a button whose goal is to perform an action. Primary CTA is the most important button in your design, the Buy Now or Continue. A secondary CTA is the fallback option, usually, or the option that is, as the name suggests, secondary. Everything else falls under the tertiary CTA category, and it's the rest of the buttons on the interface. Talking about the states of a button, normal is the normal state of a button. Hover is when you're using a mouse, it's to indicate you're over a button now, and it's ready when you are. Pressed is, well, when the button is pressed. Inactive is when you can't use the button right now. This is usually when you need to complete a form, and then and only then can you press that button to continue. And now let's talk about copy. So have great size of the button, have affordance, I added a cute audio feedback, and I've accounted for all the states. What's next? So what's the button doing? What happens if I press it? What is the action you are calling me to do? That's when you need the label. It's okay to have an icon if it's recognizable to the people using it, but text is used for those important CTAs we were talking about. But what should the text say? So the interface, you can think of it as a discussion, a communication between the device and the person that's using it. What the button is communicating is what happens when you tap or click on it. Apply, save, cancel, and close are some of the examples. They're all action verbs, and the fewer words used, the better. To sum up, a good copy would be actionable, simple, and concise. Spacing. When having many buttons next to each other, remember Fitts law and distance to the target, we need to make sure that there is enough space between the buttons so that people don't click or tap on them by accident. A good example of spacing is the tab bar on iOS. And last but not least, accessibility. When designing for a button, it's essential to consider the accessibility, which is, apart from the colors, should also extend to the label the screen reader would parse. A good way of doing this, depending of course on the team project and complexity of the interface, would be to create a table with the element copy and the screen reader copy next to each other for all the elements. So to sum up, when designing a button for screens, we need to keep in mind the size, the affordance, the audio and other feedback, the states, the copy, the spacing, and of course accessibility. As we're talking about buttons, there is one very distinct CTA below with the copy subscribe calling you to action. So please click or tap, depending on the device you're watching this from, to not miss any future episodes. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you find this useful and see you next time.